The war was still burning when the child wrote the last date in his diary. Bombs were falling, sirens were screaming, and yet his small handwriting did not shake. He wrote a single sentence that no one would read for decades. The war will end on this day, and I will not be here to see it. At that moment, the world outside his window was convinced the war would last forever. Soldiers were dying by the thousands, borders were collapsing, and hope had become a dangerous word. But inside a ruined town, a child believed the ending was already decided. His name was Elias, and he was only 11 years old. No one knew why he kept a diary during a time when paper was more valuable than food. No one knew how he chose the dates he carefully circled in red ink. His mother thought it was just a way to escape the noise of the war. His father believed it was childish imagination trying to survive fear. The soldiers who passed their house never noticed the quiet boy watching them. They never saw how Elias looked at the sky before every air raid. He did not look afraid. He looked like someone waiting for confirmation. The diary began on an ordinary morning filled with smoke and hunger. Elias wrote about empty streets and broken windows. He wrote about the sound of boots marching past his door every night. He wrote about his mother counting bread slices with trembling fingers. But between these ordinary horrors, strange sentences appeared. He wrote about battles that had not yet happened. He wrote about cities that would soon fall. He wrote about a general who would surrender unexpectedly. Each prediction was written calmly, without drama or pride. It was as if he were copying something he had already seen. At first, no one paid attention. Children were not supposed to understand war. Children were supposed to be wrong. Then one of Elias's predictions came true. A nearby town fell exactly on the day he had written. His mother dismissed it as coincidence. Coincidences were easier than fear. Then a second prediction came true, and then a third. Neighbors began to whisper quietly when Elias passed by. Some crossed themselves when they saw him. Others refused to let their children play near him. Rumors spread faster than bullets. They said the boy was cursed. They said he was blessed. They said the war spoke to him in dreams. Elias never defended himself. He never explained his diary. He only continued writing, night after night, by candlelight. His final pages were the most disturbing. They spoke of silence. They spoke of empty battlefields. They spoke of flags coming down. And they spoke of a day when the guns would finally stop. That date was written clearly and underlined twice. It was a date no commander dared to predict. It was a date no newspaper would publish. Elias showed the page to his father one evening. His father stared at it for a long time without speaking. Then he closed the diary and told Elias never to show it again. Fear had entered the house that night, not fear of bombs, but fear of knowing too much. Weeks later, during a sudden evacuation, chaos swallowed the town. Families ran, soldiers shouted, and fires burned uncontrolled. Elias clutched his diary as they fled. Somewhere on the road, they were separated. Smoke erased faces, screams erased names. When the war moved on, Elias was gone. No body was found, no grave was marked. Only the diary remained, buried under rubble in the abandoned house. Years passed, and the war ended exactly on the date Elias had written. The world celebrated peace without knowing his name. Cities rebuilt, flags changed, and memories faded. The ruined town was eventually forgotten. Decades later, construction workers broke through an old wall. A small book fell into the dust. Its pages were yellow, but the ink was still clear. The final sentence froze everyone who read it. If you are reading this, then the war has ended. Below it was a name. Below it was a date. And below that was a warning written in a child's hand. Do not forget what it cost. The room fell silent as history held its breath. No one spoke for a long time, because the diary was not just a prediction. It was a message sent forward in time, and it was waiting for someone to listen. The child who knew the war would end had finally been heard. But his story was far from complete. because the diary contained more pages. The final page of the diary lay open, still heavy with the child's warning. Dust settled slowly around the words, as if the ruined room itself was listening. The workers did not speak, because none of them felt alone anymore. That night, the diary was wrapped carefully and carried out of the forgotten house. No one noticed the smallest detail at first. The final page was not the end. Several pages were still sealed together, stuck by age and time. When they were gently separated, the story continued. Elias had written beyond the end of the war. He had written beyond his own disappearance. The next entry was dated years after the guns fell silent. It described peace as something fragile and temporary. Elias wrote that people would celebrate loudly to avoid remembering quietly. He wrote that monuments would be built, but lessons would be ignored. His handwriting remained calm, as if nothing surprised him anymore. Page after page revealed events that had already happened. Borders changing, leaders falling, old enemies shaking hands for photographs. Historians who first read the diary felt their confidence collapse. This was no lucky prediction. This was knowledge written in advance. One entry described a soldier returning home alive. The details matched a real man whose life had already been recorded. Even the words he would speak to his wife were written there. Another page described a city rebuilding too quickly. Elias warned that speed would erase memory. He underlined one sentence twice. When memory fades, war prepares its return. The diary then turned inward. Elias began writing about himself. He wrote about the day he would vanish. He wrote that chaos would open a door no one else could see. I will not die, he wrote. I will be carried forward by what happens next. The date matched the evacuation of his town exactly. The moment he disappeared from history. One page was darker than the rest. The handwriting pressed deep into the paper. Elias wrote that he had not chosen this knowledge. He wrote that the future came to him, memories of another life. He never explained why he was chosen. He only explained why he wrote. Someone must remember before it happens again. As the diary neared its end, the tone changed. The calm certainty began to crack. Elias wrote faster, shorter sentences. He wrote that people would someday find his words by accident. He wrote that they would doubt him. He wrote that they would argue instead of listening. Then came the final prediction. It was not a war. It was not an invasion. It was a choice. A moment when humanity would decide whether memory mattered. The date was circled in red. The same red used to mark the end of the war. That date was close, very close. Those who read the diary felt fear return. Not fear of bombs or soldiers, fear of responsibility. Because if Elias had been right before, he could be right again. The diary was locked away, sealed from the public. Silence was chosen once more. But silence never saved anyone in Elias's world. Copies were made. Whispers escaped the archive. The child's words began traveling again. Survivors read them and cried. Younger generations read them and argued. The calendar moved closer to the red circled date. And one final page remained unread. It was folded differently from the rest. As if Elias hesitated before writing it. As if he knew this page would hurt the most. When it was finally opened, only one sentence was written there. This is where you decide if my story ends. The room went silent again, because Elias was no longer predicting history. He was speaking directly to the present, and to whoever was listening now. The diary did not explain the choice. It only warned of its course. The date was now only days away, and the meaning of Elias's disappearance was finally becoming clear. He had not vanished by accident. He had stepped aside for this moment. The sentence on the folded page did not explain the choice, but it demanded one. Those who read it felt as if the diary was no longer a record of the past. It had become a mirror held up to the present. The red circled date was now only days away. Historians argued behind closed doors, but none of them could change the calendar. The diary was moved again, deeper into storage, as if distance could weaken its power. Yet the words had already escaped. Copies passed quietly from hand to hand. People began rereading earlier pages with new eyes. They noticed something they had missed before. Elias never predicted what people would choose. He only predicted what would happen, because they forgot. One passage, buried near the middle, suddenly felt heavier than the rest. Elias wrote that wars do not begin with gunfire. They begin when stories are simplified, when suffering is reduced to dates and numbers, when memory becomes comfortable instead of painful. Survivors of the war felt exposed by those words. They had spent years trying to forget just to survive. Elias did not blame them. He wrote that forgetting was human. He wrote that repeating was the danger. As the final date approached, small things began to happen. Speeches were made that sounded too familiar. Old language returned to new mounts. Lines were drawn where scars still existed. Elias had written about this moment without naming it. He called it the echo. He wrote that every generation hears it. Few recognize it in time. The night before the date, the diary was opened once more. The folded page was read again, slower this time. Beneath the sentence, barely visible, another line appeared. It had been written so lightly it almost vanished into the paper. Remembering is the choice. The meaning struck harder than any prediction. Elias had not come to warn about a single event. He had come to test whether people would listen at all. At dawn, memorials across different cities filled unexpectedly. Not with ceremonies, with silence. People stood without speeches or flags. Parents told children stories they had never spoken aloud. Names were read instead of numbers. Faces replaced statistics. The day passed without disaster. No war began. No headlines exploded. Some called it proof the diary was meaningless. Others understood something quieter had happened. Elias had written that prevention never feels dramatic. It feels like nothing happened. As the dates slipped into history, scholars returned to the diary's earliest pages. They noticed the first entry again, the one written before anyone knew Elias mattered. It described a child listening to adults argue about the war's beginning. Elias wrote that no one agreed on how it started. That confusion frightened him more than the bombs. In the final entry, written just before his disappearance, Elias explained himself at last. He wrote that he did not see the future, he remembered it. He wrote that time did not move forward for him, it circled, and he had been allowed to step briefly outside it. His disappearance was not an accident of chaos. It was the moment he was returned to the circle. Elias ended his explanation with a question. Did you keep the memory alive? The diary closed with no answer written. Because the answer was never meant to be on the page. It was meant to exist in the world. The house where the diary was found was left standing. No one rebuilt over it. A small marker was placed inside the room. It did not carry Elias's name. It carried his sentence. Remembering is the choice. Children now visit the place on quiet afternoons. Some of them keep journals of their own. Most write ordinary things. One child wrote a date and then crossed it out. He wrote instead, I hope we don't need this. The diary rests nearby. Finally silent. Elias never returned. He never needed to. Because the future he feared had paused. Not ended, just delayed by memory. And the child, who knew the war would end, left the ending where it belonged. In the hands of those who remembered. Remembering did not end the story. It only delayed the forgetting. Years passed after the red circled date, and the world moved on again. The diary stayed where it was, untouched but never ignored. Visitors came quietly, not looking for answers, but for reminders. Some left flowers, others left notes they never signed. History books mentioned the war, but not the child. Elias remained a whisper, not a chapter. Yet his presence lingered in small, unnoticed ways. Teachers began telling harder truths. Parents spoke more honestly to their children. Survivors allowed themselves to remember without shame. Elias had written that memory weakens with comfort, and comfort eventually returned. One winter, a researcher studying the diary noticed something new. The paper had not aged evenly. One section remained strangely preserved. It was the space after the final entry, blank pages Elias never filled. Under special lights, faint indentations appeared. Words that had been pressed, but never inked. Slowly, carefully, they were revealed. Elias had planned to write more. He had stopped himself. The hidden text formed a final message. If you are reading this far in the future, then memory survived longer than I expected. The message continued, uneven and uncertain. But it will fade again. Elias wrote that he did not believe in permanent peace. He believed in constant effort. He wrote that every generation must choose memory for itself. No diary could do that work forever. The researcher closed the book with shaking hands. Elias had never wanted to be a prophet. He wanted to be a reminder. That night, the researcher dreamed of a quiet boy standing in a ruined street. Elias did not speak. He only watched. The dream felt unfinished, like a question still waiting. Months later, another conflict began somewhere else, smaller, distant, easy to ignore. The headlines felt familiar. The language felt old. The echo returned. People argued whether it mattered. Some reached for the diary again. Others dismissed it as history. Elias had written about this moment too, not as a prediction, as a warning. Memorials filled once more, not because disaster had struck, but because people remembered what happens when it is ignored. The conflict did not grow. It stalled, then faded. No one celebrated. There was nothing dramatic to praise. Prevention never makes heroes. Elias knew that. Time continued its circle. New children were born into quieter days. Some of them felt drawn to stories of the past. One child asked why the diary had no ending. An adult answered honestly, "Because it isn't finished yet. The house still stands. The room remains empty. The diary rests open to its first page. Until its last blank one." Elias never returned to write the ending. He left it where it belonged, not in ink, not in prophecy, but in choice. The war ended long ago. The child disappeared even earlier, but the question remains alive. It passes quietly from hand to hand, from memory to memory. Every time someone chooses to remember, every time someone refuses to simplify suffering, Elias's story continues, not as history, not as myth, but as responsibility.